Good luck, babe. Don't be nervous. You're going to be great.
All right.
Be great, okay?
Thank you. All right. Just bear with me as I just check that everything's working. Okay, I seem to be having some technical challenges on my side here. Waiting to just see if this will start cooperating. Seems to be loading. Okay. All right. Just going to wait for a couple more people to join and for my software to cooperate. Okay. Right. Things seem to have frozen. Good morning all, if you can hear me. Okay, slowly things start to be coming together. Apologies for the delay. Okay. So, looks like we are getting going. All right. So, welcome to this morning's live chat. We'll be talking about parenting in a pandemic. This is my first live chat, so I'm dealing with all the technical ins and outs. So please just bear with me, especially in the beginning, as we just get things rolling. But it does seem like things are coming together, which is great. So right, so maybe just to start, let me just introduce myself. So my name is Lloyd Ripley-Evans. I am a psychologist, speaker, and also a coach. And I spend a lot of time talking and engaging with clients on an individual level. I spend a lot of time with couples, talking about couple dynamics. And for the last probably decade, I spent operating within a educational environment, looking at parent-child dynamics, teacher-child dynamics, and so on and so forth. So I have a very keen interest in terms of working with couples and working with individuals and helping them to be the best that they can be. So today I'm going to be talking about some elements about parenting during a pandemic, some considerations. I'll talk about some fundamental considerations with regards to just relationships in general. If you have happened to see any or read any of the recent articles that I've written, I started a bit of a series of articles that I've called COVID relationships. The first article was quite a broad, general article that looked at some fundamentals, which I'm going to touch on today. The second article was more specifically to with regards to couples, and the most recent article was with regards to the parent-child dynamic, which I think is naturally quite a tricky, difficult one, but especially during these times that we find ourselves in at the moment. So that's sort of in a nutshell, what I'll be talking about today. I think we need to consider the fact that our current situation in this lockdown during this COVID time, it's going to place a significant amount of stress and pressure on all of us. The relationships that we experience, no matter how good, no matter how strong they are going to take strain at some point. Because our world's been sort of tipped on its head. Life as we know it has had to change significantly. And as such, our relationships also need to change. And I'm going to look at that in a little bit more detail today. Just a little bit more context in terms of to give you some understanding from where I come and how I practice. So I practice from a very systemic perspective, which means that I try to work with individuals or couples within their systems, from within their perspectives, and considering the different dynamics, relationships, and influences that impact them. I find this very helpful because I'm very much a believer that no man is an island and that we are the product of our environments. So everything that happens to us and around us impacts us, and we need to consider this. I recently read an article by a lady who was talking about, it's okay to be a different parent during these times, during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And she was referring to how her life had got tipped on its head when her husband had passed away a number of years ago, and how routines and habits and just all the sort of little things that you do in your relationships and the goals and hopes and all of that have changed and shifted for her. And she relates that similarly to the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. And looking more specifically at the sort of parenting dynamic, she goes on to say that, when something outside of our control changes life, it's what you do with what you can control that really shapes your children. And that really spoke to me because I'm a firm believer that as parents and just as adults, we are the role models for our children. We set the tone for the lessons that they learn. We guide them. We dictate the type of people that they will become. And we need to realize the significance of what we do on a daily basis. So I'm going to be talking quite a lot to ourselves as the adults, as the parents, what we need to be doing, what we need to be considering, because it is really up to us. Our children learn from us, and we need to keep reminding ourselves about that. Just before we launch into the sort of foundations of relationships, I want to just an important point. There is a lot of information out there on the internet, loads of articles, loads of websites that provide some really good tips, tools, insights, understanding, and so on for a whole host of things. But if we're looking at parenting, if you have any problems, you can Google and you can come across some information that can be quite helpful to you. It might be tips to engage with your teenage child. It might be how to talk about how to have the awkward conversations with your 10-year-old, or whatever the case is. And this information is all great. These books are all great. These talks that you might attend to on this, the information is very worthwhile. What I find to be a challenge to this, however, is that all of this information doesn't consider the primary sort of factor that we need to engage with first, and that's ourselves. All this information is all good and well, but when it comes to the implementation, if we are not in a good space, if we are not in the right head and heart space, then we're going to be struggling. if we are not in the right space to have the conversations with our children, if we are not able to deal with the stuff for ourselves first, then the changes, the conversations that we have and so on are more than likely going to be relatively short-lived or not have the impact that we want them to have. So what I like to do from my perspective and in the talks that I do and the engagements that I have is to try to shift the perspective that clients have and that parents have off of their children, off of the sort of things that they need to do, and onto, well, what do I need to do first? And that is sort of look inwards. Let me consider what's going on for me. So, an example of this might be a parent struggling. Maybe their child's developed a certain attitude. Maybe it's developmental, maybe it's because of something happening, maybe it's because they've been locked up in the house for the last 4 weeks or whatever the case, but they're really struggling with their child's attitude. And they may go seek some information, chat to friends, and go, right, I'm going to have a conversation with my child. They may engage, there may be some sort of positive engagement and positive outcome of that. But the sort of crux of this comes down to what frame of mind are you as the parent in when you're seeking this information and when you're engaging with your child? What buttons and triggers are going on for you when you're preparing for this, when you are engaging with your child? These are all very important considerations because that's going to determine how effective the conversation is and how sustainable the change is moving forward. So we really need to sort of focus on the things that are important first, and that is, number one, ourselves. I always say to my clients that you are the epicenter of your own life. And as such, we've got to put ourselves first. We've got to consider what it is that we are feeling, what we're experiencing, what we're fearful of, and so on and so forth. Because that is going to provide the emotional motivation and ultimately direct us in terms of how we move forward with the people around us. Also being able to sort of focus on the right things helps us reprioritize the energy that we give to ourselves and to the things around us. Again, considering that idea of control, what we can control, what we can't control. So often we waste so much energy on the things that we can't control. We waste so much energy on sort of worrying about things that are outside of our control, worrying about what might or might not happen, and we don't sort of consider that we need to invest the time in the things that we can control. So again, that's sort of what I'm going to be sort of encouraging us to do today. So as I said, I'm going to be looking at some relationship fundamentals, and I'm going to start with the sort of 6 points or that I determine or I see are fundamentals to all relationships. Because relationships are sort of what life's all about, whether it's with our children, with our partners, with our colleagues, with sort of celebrities through the sort of distant vicarious relationships. Relationships are sort of what we fall back on every day. It's what energizes us as well as what sort of drains our energy. So the staying at home period certainly has shaken all of our relationships, as I mentioned. It's changed how we engage. It's changed why we engaged. It's given perspective to all of us on our relationships. It's given insight into the strength of our relationship. It's brought to the surface some cracks in our relationships. As difficult as this time has been, I certainly look at this, and this is the eternal optimist in me, I look at this lockdown period as a significant opportunity that we would never have had otherwise. It's an opportunity to have this intense time with our families, with our partners, an intense time with ourselves to reflect and think and all the rest. And it really is an incredible opportunity. So through this opportunity, I'd like to encourage us all to start to consider how we can change the way that we engage in a positive way. we need to consider why we need to change. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit now, because we want to maintain the strong positive intensity of our relationships, and not create or encourage the cracks and these canyons to develop between us. So the relationship fundamentals, I'm going to just sort of discuss them one by one. If there are any questions, obviously you can pop them in the comments, and at the end we can have some time to discuss them. So the very first fundamental that we need to bear in mind is that all relationships take effort. Doesn't matter what relationship we are talking about, every single relationship takes effort. And relationships actually take a lot of effort. What we also need to bear in mind is that effort, the amount of effort, the type of effort is not static. This is going to change from when a relationship begins. If you think about you and a partner, when you guys started, dating, getting married, or whatever the case is, or wherever you are in that relationship, you can reflect, and I'm sure you'll quite easily be able to identify how that effort that was put in has shifted and changed. The time we are in at the moment requires significant shifts in the effort that we put into relationships, because the normal relationship that we used to have is no more. Things are different. So let's consider how things were before this whole COVID situation. The types of effort that you maybe put into your relationship with your partner, that you maybe put in with your children. How has that changed now? For example, as a parent-child relationship, you'd wake up in the morning, get them ready, ship them off to school, and you wouldn't see them for a good few hours. With older children, you may not see them until that evening. So the amount of effort that you'd be putting in on a daily basis was relatively low. Now, however, where we are forced, encouraged, challenged to be to wear these sort of multiple hats during the day, and you having to be teacher and disciplinarian and parent and work and all sorts of things. How has the effort shifted and changed that you need to put into these relationships with your children? It's shifted significantly. And if we're not cognizant of it, this can be extremely draining. We can be required to put in so much more while we're still trying to do everything else that we used to do. And it sort of gets a bit out of hand. So we need to be cognizant of the type of effort that we put in, the reasons we put the effort in, and how that can shift to accommodate the changes that are taking place at the moment. Just being able to reflect on how things were, not to sit and sort of wallow in the sadness that things aren't like that anymore, but to be able to think, okay, well, we used to do this and now we have to do this. Being able to sort of draw a distinction between this is what it was and this is what it is helps us to determine how we can shift what we need to do. So the amount of effort and the type of effort needs to shift and change, because all relationships take effort. Second to that is this concept of balance. And all relationships require balance. All relationships are sort of the seesaw that sort of, not very often will it stay stationary, sort of nice and flat and balanced. It's always going to be tipping to one side or the other. But ultimately, relationships are geared towards balancing itself out. We need to bear this in mind again, because the way that we used to balance beforehand, before this COVID situation, is going to be different to how we balance now. How we maintain this balance, the things that we used to do, the activities we used to do, the conversations we used to have, and so on, are going to need to change. And balance is really, really important, because if that sort of seesaw in your relationships tips too far, we've got to consider whether it's tipped sort of to that, to what I'll discuss a little bit later on in terms of that breaking point. Balance is really important, because balance in one dynamic is also going to affect the balance in other dynamics. For example, if you're engaging with your child and maybe they're a bit emotional and maybe a bit snappy, and they push a couple buttons for you, and the balance in your relationship with your child gets tipped. More than likely, that imbalance is going to spill over into your other relationships, where maybe your partner walks into the room and you are feeling frustrated or irritated, and then who bears the brunt of that? Very often it's those closest to us. So now there's spillover. Now what about the dynamics in that relationship? Now that's seesaw tips. Things that we could have done maybe pre this lockdown period is maybe go for a walk, get out, go to the shops, go to gym if we're feeling frustrated. And it's an opportunity to sort of clear our minds or cool off, and then we can come back and re-engage in a more positive way. During this time, we don't have that opportunity. We don't have the chance to get out, to breathe. And so what happens to the balance? Is it that we stay unbalanced for a couple of days as opposed to maybe a couple of hours or a couple of minutes beforehand, before COVID, before this pandemic? So we need to consider this balance. How balanced do I feel in my dynamics or my relationships that I have? How do I feel about the balance between my partner and I? How do I feel about the balance between my children or my child and I? Is it this constant sort of up and down sort of seesaw motion? Because that can also be pretty exhausting. We want the balance to be relatively sort of a gentle, sort of a calmness to that balance. So all relationships require balance. And we need to consider what's happening in our relationships at the moment. The third fundamental is space. That all relationships have space parameters. Now, these space parameters are not just physical space, which we can all, I'm sure, relate to during this COVID time, has been very challenging because our physical space has been restricted. We've been sort of restricted to our homes. And even if you've got a relatively big home, it's incredible how small it can feel. If you are staying in a relatively small space or a small flat or whatever the case is, then you're really going to feel it because you've got nowhere to escape. But as I was mentioning, the space is not just physical space. It's also our mental and emotional space. Because we need time in the day to just be able to think, to just be, to kind of process our emotions, to feel our emotions. So these space parameters, they're going to vary from person to person. They're going to vary from time to time as we sort of move through our lives. But we need to consider the physical, mental, and emotional space. Now, again, considering this COVID pandemic, how have these space parameters been affected? Physically, obviously, we can understand that, and today I've heard many people going or talking about going for runs and walks and getting out within a 5-kilometer radius of their houses, which is great. It's going to sort of do wonders for, I think, people's mental and emotional spaces. But what or how has this lockdown period affected our space parameters? Are we able to still have the space that we need? Are we able to still just kind of retreat into ourselves for a little bit in a day, just to think, to reflect, to be? Can we or can't we? An important consideration here as well is just how has the the online component to this lockdown affected the space parameter or concept of space for us. Because as much as we may be able to, we've got space and we can move around our houses and I'll stay in my room, you stay in your room, and we can manage ourselves like that. And we can have our mental and emotional space and physical space. But a challenge that I've seen and heard coming up time and time again is the fact that our communication and sort of information sharing is just relentless. We've got emails, phone calls, video conferences, video lessons, video teaching, video dance lessons, and the list goes on and on and on. So at the moment, and for the last few weeks, there's been this intense amount of connectivity that we've all been experiencing, which can also significantly impact that sense or that feeling of space. I've also heard a few people sort of just disconnect, just switch off their devices for a day or two because they actually just need that space. So how has this all impacted you? How has it impacted those around you? How has this impacted your children? The space concept, or this idea of space, is a significant one because the space element is going to impact our balance. So all of these are interrelated, and we need to bear that in mind. The fourth fundamental consideration is this idea of that all relationships have routines. Now, human beings are creatures of habit. We like to do things that we feel comfortable with, that we know and that we understand. Having that sense of comfort, that sense of understanding of what's coming, is very helpful to us. It alleviates anxiety, which a lot of people have been saying they're feeling so anxious at the moment because of the uncertainty. Routines that we've been able to establish over the years, over time, help us to manage our anxiety about what's happening. They can be quite simple things like a morning coffee routine or a sort of a bedtime sort of preparation routine, or can be something more significant in terms of routines on a daily basis for the family as a whole. But these routines are really important because they provide this structure which helps to provide a sense of grounding. During this lockdown period, our routines have been tipped on their heads. They've been knocked over, and we can't continue sort of with the routines that we used to have. So what are we doing to counteract this change? Are we fighting the fact that we want to sort of just do what we used to do, or sort of struggling with the fact that we just can't do it anymore? Stuck in the space where we can't sort of take steps forward to implement change? Or are we able to implement and engage in some new and adaptive routines? An important consideration with the idea of routines is to consider what does that routine, or what did that routine fulfill for us? What needs was that routine fulfilling? Because if we just looking to find an alternative, for example, if it's just a coffee, you used to go for a quick cup of coffee on your way into work, now you can't. And you say, okay, well, now I'm going to just have a coffee at home. More than likely, it's not going to fulfill the same need, because actually it's not about the coffee. Maybe it is all about the caffeine for you, but maybe it's more than likely less about the actual coffee and more about that little routine, that you're able to have maybe 5 minutes to yourself. You can maybe just plan your day or whatever the case, but there's certain needs that are addressed. So as we're looking at implementing new routines, and we're looking at so that the months ahead where we're going to need these routines to continue or new routines to be introduced, we need to consider what needs do we need to address in these new routines. And that's what needs do we need to satisfy? It's very important. Otherwise, we're going to remain sort of frustrated, and then again that balance gets shifted, and making things awkward and difficult and uncomfortable. The fifth consideration, or fundamental, is the idea of comfort zones. Our relationships, for the most part, should hopefully be or create a space of comfort for us, a safe space where we're able to let our guard down. And this will be in varying degrees depending on the types of relationships that you have. Obviously, with our children, we'll be able to engage and feel safe in some ways. With our partners, we can do that in other ways. But ultimately, relationships need to provide a sense of comfort, a sense of safety. When things change and we're presented with various challenges, the comfort zone sort of may shrink a little bit. We may start to feel a little bit less safe, less comfortable in certain spaces and relationships. And that's okay. I mean, that's life. Relationships have these sort of ebbs and flows, and that's okay. What is important is to be cognizant of the fact that relationships, the comfort zone space, is going to change. We need to be aware of what is happening in our comfort zones, what's taking place. and sort of how much it's changed. Has it changed significantly that we're really feeling sort of uncomfortable at the moment? Or has it changed just a little bit and we sort of can tolerate it for a little while?